city built on revolution is awakening again. On a freezing October night, the streets of St. Petersburg trembled, not with the rumble of tanks, but with a haunting melody. Hundreds of young Russians stood defiantly under flickering streetlights singing Swan Lake, the same music that once heralded the death of the Soviet Union. Phones lit the darkness as riot police formed lines. The sound was not just music, it was rebellion. Could this be the moment history begins to repeat itself? Could the empire that sought to erase 1991 now be reliving it? The song that echoed through Nevsky Prospect was more than defiance, it was prophecy. In the heart of Putin's hometown, the anthem of collapse returned forbidden, yet unstoppable. The regime had banned Tchaikovsky's masterpiece 2 years earlier, labeling it extremist. But on October 15, 2025, that ban was broken by the very generation raised under Putin's shadow. They sang not for nostalgia, but for liberation. Reuters reports that within minutes, videos of the protests flooded encrypted channels before the Kremlin slowed the internet across major cities. The BBC confirmed arrests, beatings, and digital blackouts. Yet the melody persisted, broadcast by courage, not by state television. The symbolism was too powerful to contain. This was St. Petersburg, the city of the Winter Palace, the Aurora Cruiser, and the October Revolution. Every chant here echoes through Russian history like a drumbeat of fate. Analysts from The Guardian and DW called it psychological warfare in musical form. The regime's nightmare had come alive not in Dagestan or Kursk, but in the cradle of revolt. For Putin, this city was more than symbolic, it was personal. It was where his power began, and now where his authority was unraveling. Losing St. Petersburg would mean losing the very myth of his invincibility. Strategically, the uprising struck at the heart of the Kremlin's control system. A protest in a distant region can be crushed. But when defiance erupts in the imperial capitals St. Petersburg and Moscow, the state trembles. Intelligence sources cited by Jane's Defense Weekly warned that interior security units were redeployed from western Ukraine back into Russian cities, leaving frontline defenses thinner than ever. Every soldier sent home is one less rifle at the front, noted Defense News. And while Russia's streets filled with unrest, the world watched. In Kiev, officials called it the first crack in the Kremlin wall. In Tehran and Beijing, state media avoided the topic altogether. But Washington under President Donald Trump issued a statement emphasizing the universal right to peaceful assembly and quietly increased intelligence sharing with NATO allies. The United States sensed that what began with a song could soon reshape the balance of power. For ordinary Russians, the melody of Swan Lake carried both pain and promise. It was the music of funerals, the soundtrack of collapse, but also the whisper of freedom. My parents watched this ballet when the USSR fell, said one young protester to Al Jazeera before being detained. Now it's our turn. The world has seen this pattern before when hunger meets repression and history meets its echo. If the streets of St. Petersburg can awaken ghosts of revolution, how long before Moscow itself begins to tremble? The morning after the music, the Kremlin stood silent. No speeches, no broadcasts, just denial. But silence in Russia has always spoken louder than words. On Nevsky Prospect, shattered glass and torn banners marked the ground where history stirred once more. The city's breath hung in the frozen air like smoke from an old revolution reborn. St. Petersburg, the cradle of 1917, had done what no modern army could. It had made the Kremlin afraid. This city's ghosts are not easily silenced. From the workers' marches of 1905 to the storming of the Winter Palace, revolt has lived in its veins. When protesters now gather under Tchaikovsky's haunting notes, they awaken a memory buried deep in the Russian soul. The memory of a people who once overthrew a czar. Every time St. Petersburg rises, power in Moscow trembles, a historian told DW. The parallels are unmistakable and for Vladimir Putin intolerable. Strategically, St. Petersburg is more than a stage for dissent. It is Russia's cultural heart, its window to Europe, its symbol of enlightenment and modernity. Founded by Peter the Great to connect Russia with the West, it now defies the man who cut those ties. When young people sing in its squares, they are not just rejecting a ruler, they are rejecting isolation itself. This is Russia's European spirit rebelling against Eurasian despotism. Putin knows this city too well. It is where his political career began, where he served as deputy mayor before ascending to absolute power. Losing control here means being rejected by his own birthplace, by the very soil that once raised him. It's a psychological wound, wrote The Guardian. To lose St. Petersburg is to lose legitimacy. That is why security forces there operate with brutal precision, yet even repression cannot erase symbolism. The strategic analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly noted that the Russian Interior Ministry had quietly reactivated old containment protocols first used during the Chechen Wars, deploying counterinsurgency units in civilian zones. But unlike the mountains of the Caucasus, St. Petersburg's battlefield is psychological. Every baton strike deepens resentment. Every arrest spreads defiance. The Kremlin's own tactics are now feeding the flames. Beyond Russia, echoes of this unrest ripple through the world's fault lines. In Kyiv, Ukraine's defense ministry sees opportunity. Putin's war is collapsing from within, it declared. In Tel Aviv and Tehran, analysts draw comparisons to their own internal protests, warning that regimes built on fear eventually drown in it. Meanwhile, Washington under President Trump views the turmoil as a historic opening. A weakened Russia reshapes every negotiation, from NATO's posture in Eastern Europe to China's calculations in the Pacific. If Russia implodes, one senior Pentagon source told Reuters Beijing recalibrates overnight. But for ordinary citizens, these grand strategies mean little. What matters are the empty shelves, the silence of friends taken in the night, the fading illusion that tomorrow will be better. Our parents endured one empire's collapse, said a teacher interviewed by Al Jazeera. Now we are watching another die. The sound of Swan Lake now lingers like a curse, a reminder that even empires can hear their own funeral marches. If the past is repeating itself, the question remains: how many times can Russia survive the same revolution before it breaks for good? When bread vanishes from the shelves, silence vanishes from the streets. What began as a moral rebellion has turned into a revolt of hunger. Across Russia's industrial cities, families queue for basic groceries under the dull glow of supermarket lights. Wages stagnate, taxes soar, and the ruble has lost a third of its value since spring. People don't protest for ideals anymore, wrote Reuters last week. They protest because their children are hungry. The Kremlin's war economy, funded through an emergency 22% value-added tax, has drained ordinary citizens while feeding the war machine. Defense factories run day and night, yet hospitals lack medicine and schools lack heat. Once loyal workers now whisper rebellion during factory breaks. In Siberia, a miner told BBC News, "We used to be proud. Now we can't even afford bread." The discontent is spreading not from universities, but from kitchens. Analysts from DW call this the second wave of collapse, when ideology dies and survival takes over. The first wave in 2022 was moral. Students and activists marched against the injustice of war. But in 2025, as inflation spirals past 19%, the protesters are no longer just the educated elite. Farmers, truckers, pensioners all stand in line for what little remains. The economic walls that once separated classes are crumbling, uniting them in desperation. Inside the Kremlin, panic is quiet, but real. The regime's last claim to legitimacy, economic stability, has shattered. Putin built his rule on the promise of order after chaos, noted The Guardian. Now he's delivering chaos after order. Intelligence briefings leaked to Jane's Defense Weekly show fears of a chain reaction, localized food riots, turning into mass strikes, then into coordinated civil resistance. The Kremlin is fighting a war on two fronts, one in Ukraine, the other in its own breadlines. In global terms, Russia's internal crisis is a gift to its rivals and a warning to its allies. Washington and Brussels, under Trump's recalibrated doctrine of strategic realism, view the implosion as an opening to tighten economic sanctions without risking direct confrontation. Meanwhile, Beijing, once Moscow's silent partner, has begun restricting energy contracts, wary of betting on a sinking ship. In Tehran, hardliners whisper that Moscow's winter may come for them next. Across the world, fragile regimes study St. Petersburg's uprising like a mirror reflecting their own fears. But for those on the streets, geopolitics offers no comfort. In Nizhny Novgorod, a mother clutches her child as riot police storm a bakery queue. In Yekaterinburg, striking steelworkers chant Swan Lake through megaphones, their voices hoarse but unbroken. This is not politics, one protester told Al Jazeera. This is survival. The question now is not whether Russians believe in the state, but whether they still fear it. History shows that when hunger and humiliation converge, even the strongest regimes crumble. The Kremlin may still command its armies, but it cannot command a starving people. When the same melody that once mourned the Soviet Union becomes the anthem of the hungry, what can power do except listen and wait for the next verse? Moscow has not slept for weeks. The city's grand boulevards, once symbols of power, now echo with unease. At night, armored trucks idle near Pushkin Square, their engines humming beneath the Kremlin's glow. The air is heavy, not with snow, but with fear. For the first time in 2 decades, the regime's loyalists whisper the unthinkable, what if this is how it ends? Inside, the Kremlin security meetings stretch past dawn. Generals debate whether to redeploy more troops from Ukraine to guard the capital. According to Reuters, Putin's inner circle has fractured into rival factions, hawks demanding total repression, pragmatists warning that bloodshed in Moscow would spark mutiny. The president remains silent on camera, his face drawn, his authority visibly eroding. The palace feels like it's under siege, said one Western intelligence official to The Guardian. The psychology of power is shifting. In 2022, regional protests were containable, a distant noise from Dagestan or Irkutsk. But a rebellion in Moscow is different. It's not a fire on the periphery, it's smoke in the engine room. The elites, the oligarchs, the generals, the Siloviki are beginning to hedge their bets. They watch the markets, the streets, and the signals from Washington. Loyalty in Russia lasts only until the next panic, observed a DW correspondent. Strategically, this unrest is a direct assault on the regime's command structure. Moscow houses the Ministry of Defense, the FSB's Lubyanka headquarters, and every propaganda hub of state television. When protest chants echo this close to those institutions, the illusion of control collapses. An uprising in Moscow is like a power outage, and the Kremlin, wrote Jane's Defense Weekly. Everything stops until the lights come back on. Washington sees this moment as a geopolitical inflection point. President Donald Trump's administration, according to Defense News, has quietly increased intelligence cooperation with NATO allies and approved contingency plans in case of regime instability. European leaders, especially in Poland and the Baltic states, are fortifying borders and activating cyber defense grids. For the West, Russia's domestic implosion could reshape everything from energy security to the war in Ukraine. But Moscow's chaos also sends tremors through the east. China watches warily. A weakened Russia destabilizes Beijing's northern flank, noted Al Jazeera. The Sino-Russian axis, once framed as unbreakable, is showing cracks. If Putin falls, Xi Jinping loses his most useful counterweight to American influence. And in Iran, where anti-government protests still simmer, the Kremlin's unraveling serves as both warning and inspiration. For ordinary Muscovites, though these are abstractions, their world is shrinking into fear and uncertainty. Banks ration withdrawals, soldiers patrol subway entrances, mothers delete messages from their phones, terrified of surveillance. Yet in every silence there is defiance. If they arrest one, 10 more appear, said a shopkeeper to BBC News. They can't arrest hunger. The Kremlin's fortress walls may still stand, but their foundations are cracking. Every protester outside is a reflection of the fear inside. Every whisper of dissent inside those marble halls carries the same question the streets are now shouting: who will protect us when the regime itself collapses? In every great empire's final act, history plays its cruelest melody. For Putin, that melody is Swan Lake. The very song that once marked the Soviet Union's death throws now echoes through his reign like a curse. Across Russia, its notes rise from balconies, subway tunnels, and anonymous phone speakers, a forbidden requiem for a dying order. The regime's reaction is desperate, almost superstitious. Within hours of the St. Petersburg uprising, internet blackouts rolled across the country. Encrypted messaging apps were blocked, independent news sites shuttered. Reuters confirmed that state television had been ordered to avoid even mentioning the ballet's name. To the Kremlin, Swan Lake is no longer art, it's an enemy. A regime that fears a melody, fears its own history, wrote The Guardian. Yet the more it bans the song, the louder it becomes. This is not strength, it's panic. DW analysts describe the government's countermeasures as archaic in a digital age. Soldiers guard Wi-Fi hubs. Police storm music schools. The irony is blinding a regime armed with nuclear missiles now trembles before violins. And as Jane's Defense Weekly reported, redeploying cyber units from Ukraine to suppress domestic networks has left Russian military communications exposed, creating new vulnerabilities at the front. Every attempt to silence rebellion weakens another front of the state. The parallels to 1991 grow impossible to ignore. Back then, as hardliners tried to topple Gorbachev's state television broadcast Swan Lake continuously for 3 days. For Russians, the sight of dancing swans meant one thing: the system was collapsing. Now in 2025, those same notes haunt the Kremlin's marble halls again. History's revenge has arrived, elegant, quiet, and merciless. Internationally, the implications are enormous. President Trump's national security team is closely monitoring the unrest, coordinating with European allies to prevent nuclear instability. We are witnessing the possible disintegration of a major power, said a senior U.S. official to Defense News. NATO's Rapid Response Command has been placed on alert while U.S. intelligence satellites track troop movements near Moscow and key military installations. Meanwhile, in Beijing, state media remain silent, but financial data tell the story. Chinese markets are quietly divesting from Russian energy. In Tehran, government spokesmen downplay parallels, fearing Swan Lake might echo in their own streets. And in Kyiv, Ukrainian troops advance cautiously aware that the enemy across the front lines may soon have no command left to obey. For Russian citizens, though, the revolution is not cinematic, it's personal. A father arrested for humming a banned tune, a pianist beaten for playing Tchaikovsky in the metro, a teacher fired for quoting Pushkin's line, "The habit of submission kills the soul." They can ban music, one protester told Al Jazeera, but they cannot ban memory. This uprising is no longer political, it's spiritual. It's the confrontation between memory and fear, truth and control. The Kremlin's attempt to erase the past has only resurrected it, and as the last notes of Swan Lake fade into the winter air, one question hangs over Russia like a curse. How can a regime survive when its own people have turned its history into a weapon? Two fronts, one war, no victory. That is Vladimir Putin's reality in 2025. The first front bleeds across the trenches of Ukraine, where exhausted soldiers fight for ground measured in meters. The second front burns in his own streets, where civilian students and workers defy the fear he built over 2 decades. And now both fronts are collapsing. The Kremlin faces what Reuters called a perfect storm of attrition. Every battalion sent to the Ukrainian front weakens domestic control. Every ruble spent on tanks drains food from Russian markets. Putin's empire is devouring itself. His generals plead for reinforcements. His ministers plead for calm. Neither can be delivered. In recent weeks, BBC News and Defense News confirmed a quiet redeployment. Thousands of National Guard troops once stationed near Mariupol have returned to Moscow and St. Petersburg. The reason: internal unrest. It's a tactical necessity, but a strategic disaster. The Ukrainian military, sensing weakness, has intensified drone strikes deep into Belgorod and Kursk. Jane's Defense Weekly reports that Russian air defenses, stretched thin, are now failing to intercept more than half of incoming attacks. This dual crisis mirrors a larger historical pattern. Empires fall not from invasion, but from implosion, wrote The Guardian. The Soviet Union learned it in 1991. Putin is learning it now. His attempt to resurrect an empire has resurrected its ghost instead. Factories are idle. Oil revenues plummet. Inflation turns loyalty into resentment. For the first time, even the Siloviki, the security elite, are divided, their loyalty uncertain. Globally, the shockwaves are unmistakable. NATO intelligence calls it Russia's 1989 moment. President Donald Trump, addressing reporters at the White House, declared the United States supports stability through strength, but tyranny always collapses under its own weight. Washington's tone is measured but firm. Trump's administration has instructed U.S. Cyber Command to monitor Russian network failures to prevent nuclear command disruptions. Europe braces for refugee waves from Kaliningrad to Belarus. And Beijing, once Moscow's quiet ally, now recalibrates its strategy, offering no rescue, only silence. The Middle East too shifts under the tremors. In Tehran, hardliners fear their own youth watching Russian protests online. In Tel Aviv, defense planners note how public dissent can paralyze authoritarian war efforts, drawing parallels to Iran's internal divisions. The global message is clear: suppression breeds collapse faster than surrender. But beyond geopolitics lies the human cost, the quiet tragedy behind the numbers. In the industrial towns of the Urals, mothers wait for sons who will never return from Ukraine or from prison. Teachers whisper forbidden songs to children. Elderly veterans weep before flickering televisions, showing no news, no truth, just silence. "We survived," Stalin says one survivor to Al Jazeera, but this feels colder. And so Swan Lake returns once more, not as a performance, but as prophecy. Russia stands on the edge of the same abyss it once escaped. The man who vowed to undo the catastrophe of 1991 has become its echo. The question now extends far beyond Moscow's walls. If the empire that defied the world is breaking from within, what comes after Putin? And more importantly, when the music stops, who will still be listening? In 2025, the haunting notes of Swan Lake returned to Russia's streets this time as the soundtrack to rebellion. From St. Petersburg to Moscow, young Russians defy ban's economic collapse and fear itself. What began as moral opposition to war has become a nationwide uprising of hunger and despair. The Kremlin's attempts to suppress dissent, cutting internet access, redeploying troops, silencing music, only reveal its panic. Analysts from Reuters, BBC DW, and The Guardian report that the regime faces simultaneous crises, a losing war abroad, and civil unrest at home. President Donald Trump's United States monitors the collapse, carefully coordinating with NATO to ensure stability while avoiding direct intervention. Meanwhile, Beijing and Tehran watch in silence, fearful that Russia's fall could spark their own. History is repeating itself with ruthless symmetry. The same melody that marked the Soviet Union's demise now heralds the twilight of Putin's rule. The empire that once feared its past is now consumed by it, and the world watches holding